The dining room gleamed with ostentatious luxury, an image of wealth and prestige that masked the undercurrents of dread and discomfort. It was as if the polished mahogany table stretched on forever, a symbol of perfection, while the chandelier above hung like a glittering crown, casting its cold light over the scene below. Crystal goblets filled with red wine, tart and biting, stood like statues, their reflection in the soft glow of the chandelier almost too perfect to be real. The aroma of roasted lamb and rosemary, heavy with a hint of something unfamiliar, wafted through the air, mingling with the silence that filled the room. But beneath the surface of this flawless image, something was deeply wrong. The strained smiles, the careful words, the way every glance seemed to study Angelica, she could feel it all. The dissonance, the judgment, the subtle cruelty masked in polite conversation. Each person around the table had their role to play, and for Angelica, hers was to stay quiet, stay small, to simply exist as part of the background. It wasn't the first time she had been here, but this dinner felt different. The weight of it pressed against her chest, suffocating her, like an invisible chain tightening with each second she remained seated in that gilded cage. Her husband, Russell, sat beside her, his presence commanding the room. He had always been the center of attention, the golden son, the one who could do no wrong, the one who thrived on admiration, basking in it like a king in his court. The kind of man who could make a room laugh with just a well-timed joke or a casual comment, the one who had always known how to play the game. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at his lips as his father, Ken, recounted his latest triumphs in the business world. Closed that merger deal in under a month, Ken's deep voice boomed, his pride swelling in the room. The partners couldn't stop singing your praises, Russell. As the conversation flowed, Angelica's name was barely mentioned, only in fleeting, hollow acknowledgments from Ken or Amanda. "You're looking well, Angelica," Ken would mutter, his gaze never meeting hers. "That dress suits you," Amanda would add, her words dripping with a syrupy sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. The words were as empty as the space Angelica felt she was occupying, just a formality to fill the silence, a formality to make her feel like she belonged. But she didn't, not here, not in this world. She was an outsider, watching from the sidelines as her husband, the shining star, took center stage. Angelica remembered a time, not long ago, when she had fallen for that very charm, that easy confidence that drew people to him, when she had believed in the man she thought she knew, the one whose strength had felt like a shield and whose laughter had warmed her. He had seemed like her protector, her rock. But as the years passed, she began to see the cracks in the facade. What had once felt like strength had turned into something else, a need to control. Where they went, what she wore, how she spoke. His charisma had hardened into something colder, a tyranny disguised as love, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Today was a special day, a celebration of Ken's birthday, a man whose stoic demeanor commanded respect. He was the epitome of power and control, a retired attorney with unshakable convictions. His gaze swept the room, sharp and unwavering, as if delivering a silent verdict on everything and everyone in sight. He carried himself like a man who believed the world bent to his will, and often it did. Amanda, his wife, offered a softer contrast, at least on the surface. She wore a pastel cardigan, a gentle smile, and spoke with a tone that was supposed to feel warm, but Angelica had learned better. Behind that sweetness lay something more calculated, a careful manipulation of others, a subtle skill in bending people to her will. As the meal progressed, the conversation continued to orbit around Russell, his successes, his future. Angelica sat quietly, her fork scraping faintly against her plate, an outsider in this carefully curated world. But the words caught in her throat, thick and unyielding, as if her voice had abandoned her completely. In that moment, Angelica knew that this was no longer just about a spilled drink. It was about everything that had been building for years, the slow erosion of her sense of self, the gradual tightening of the chains that held her in this gilded cage. And yet, for the first time in years, something inside her stirred. Something fierce, something that refused to be silenced. She offered a smile at the right moments, nodded when expected, but inside, she felt the weight of the years of silence. Her fingers tightened around her wine glass, fighting the urge to shrink into herself. Russell, once her knight in shining armor, now sat there basking in the glory of the attention, the adoration of his parents, his every word an affirmation of his importance. She couldn't help but feel small beside him, as if she no longer existed outside of his reflection, as if she were just a piece of his perfect world, a world she never truly belonged to. And then it happened, the accident that shattered the illusion. Her hand slipped, the crystal goblet tipping over, sending red wine cascading across the pristine white tablecloth. The stain bloomed like blood, a stark, ugly mark against the perfection of the setting. Time seemed to slow as every eye turned in her direction, their gazes sharp and unforgiving. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the disdain that would come next, and it did. Russell's voice cut through the silence, venomous and low. "How can you be so clumsy, Angelica?" Honestly, it's pathetic. The humiliation burned through her, but she said nothing. Her face flushed a deep crimson, and the sting of his words was far sharper than any physical blow. She opened her mouth to apologize. Would she keep swallowing his words, his insults, his control, or would she fight back? If this story has moved you, if you feel like Angelica's pain resonates with something you've experienced, or if you simply want to be part of a community that encourages strength and resilience, hit that subscribe button. Your support keeps us going and gives us the motivation to share more powerful stories like this one. Reflection question for you: which one of these statements resonates most with you? I would have stayed silent, not wanting to cause trouble in a family situation like this. B. I would have stood up and confronted the person who was making me feel small. Comment your answer below with either or. B. Let's get a conversation started. Your thoughts matter. In the early days of their relationship, Angelica had been captivated by Russell's effortless charm. He had a way about him, a natural magnetism that drew people in and made them feel special. It was more than just his looks, though those helped too. It was the way he made everyone feel like they were the only person in the room. The way his laughter, deep and genuine, could light up even the darkest of rooms. He spoke with such confidence, such ease, that it was impossible not to be enchanted. He was the kind of man who, with a smile, could sweep you off your feet, and Angelica had fallen for it wholeheartedly, but over time, things began to change. The charisma that had initially drawn Angelica to him began to evolve into something else, something darker, something colder. At first, it was subtle. A glance here, a comment there, but slowly, it began to eat away at the foundation of their relationship. Russell, the charming, confident man she had married, started showing signs of a different side of himself. The side that didn't seem so generous with attention anymore, the side that began to expect things from her, things she hadn't agreed to. Angelica hadn't noticed it at first. How could she? Russell had always been so charming, so perfect. But once they were married, the little cracks began to appear. He wanted to know where she was at all times, not because he cared, but because he couldn't stand the thought of her having any independence. He would subtly criticize her choices, dismiss her opinions, and make little comments that undermined her confidence. It wasn't direct at first, never the full blow of criticism that would have left a mark. No, he was too clever for that. It was the way he would guide the conversation to make her feel small, how he'd act as though her thoughts and feelings didn't matter as much as his own. At the start, Angelica didn't fully grasp what was happening. It was easy to justify, to believe that he was just protective, that he cared so much that he wanted to know everything about her. And so, she allowed it, but slowly, she began to lose her sense of self. She started to second-guess herself in ways she hadn't before. The confidence she once had was chipped away, bit by bit, until it was nothing more than a whisper of what it used to be. Russell's subtle control became more pronounced over time. He began dictating things that once felt like small matters: the clothes she wore, the places she went, the friends she spent time with. At first, it was under the guise of concern. He'd tell her that the dress she wore was too revealing, or that she shouldn't go to the dinner party with her friends because they were a bad influence. He would suggest, with that same smile that once melted her heart, that she might be better off staying home. Slowly, her world began to shrink. The circle of friends she had once been so close to seemed to distance themselves, almost imperceptibly, and Russell's control over her life expanded into every corner of her existence. What made it even harder to recognize was how often he still played the role of the charming, doting husband in public. He knew how to keep up appearances. The dinners, the outings, the vacations, they were all part of the act. When they were around other people, it was as if Russell had become the perfect partner, the perfect husband. He would hold her hand in public, kiss her cheek, whisper sweet nothings that still made her heart flutter, just enough to keep her tethered to the illusion of love. But when the door closed, when they were alone, the man who had once been her protector and confidant began to reveal his true nature. The control was suffocating. He would belittle her for the smallest things. If she made a decision he didn't agree with, he would dismiss it, making her feel foolish for even considering it. If she tried to express her opinion, he would either ignore her or mock her, making her feel as though her thoughts were inferior to his. He wasn't just making decisions for the two of them anymore, he was making decisions for her, and she was expected to obey. Angelica tried, at first, to fight back. She would speak up, but Russell's response was always the same. He would either ignore her completely or dismiss her as being too emotional. She began to doubt herself, to question if she was just overreacting. Maybe she was too sensitive, too needy, maybe she wasn't being fair to him. She would find herself apologizing for things she hadn't done, for feelings she hadn't asked for. And each time she did, Russell would smile, a knowing smile that made her feel like she was the one in the wrong. The more she apologized, the more he got what he wanted. The more he controlled, the more Angelica began to shrink. She stopped speaking up, she stopped standing her ground. She became a passive participant in her own life, doing whatever it took to keep the peace, even at the cost of her own happiness. At this point, Angelica could no longer recognize the man she had married. The loving, attentive partner she once knew had disappeared, replaced by someone who had no interest in her independence, her desires, or her dreams. Russell didn't see her as a partner anymore. She wasn't an equal in the relationship. She was a possession, something he could mold, something he could control to fit the life he wanted, to fit the world he wanted to create. The change was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but over time it became undeniable. The man she had once fallen in love with, the one who had swept her off her feet with his charm and laughter, had turned into someone she barely recognized. The man who had once promised to support her dreams was now the man who stifled them at every turn. In his quest to control every aspect of her life, Russell had forgotten one crucial thing, that love is not about control. Love is about freedom, it's about supporting one another, not silencing one another. And as Angelica began to feel the weight of his control more and more, she started to wonder if love was ever truly present in their relationship, or if it had all just been a carefully constructed illusion. Russell had changed, but so had Angelica. In the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, a part of her began to realize that she didn't have to live like this. She didn't have to keep shrinking herself, apologizing for things she had no control over. She began to understand that her voice mattered, that she mattered. The shift in Russell's character wasn't just a transformation of his behavior. It was the end of the man she had once loved and the beginning of something much darker. And it was in the quiet, desperate moments of her inner turmoil that Angelica realized that the only way out of this twisted version of love was to find herself again. But could she? And if she did, would it be enough to break free from the man who had consumed her life, her identity, and her soul? As she pondered this, one question remained. How much longer could she continue to live under the weight of his control before it shattered everything inside her? The first blow wasn't a punch, nor was it a slap. It didn't leave a bruise, didn't crack open her skin or draw blood. But it was still a blow, a wound that left a scar deeper than any visible mark could. It was in his words, those words, soft but cutting, that sliced through her like a blade. He called her stupid, he called her naive, he made her feel insignificant. They were the quiet, insidious kind of words, the ones that make you question everything about yourself, your worth, and your sanity. The kind of words that leave no physical evidence, but slowly chip away at the foundation of who you are, until there is nothing left but a hollow shell of the person you once were. At first, Angelica believed it was a phase. After all, Russell had always been quick with his apologies, quick to smooth things over with his charm. His comforting words that made her feel like maybe she had overreacted. Maybe she was being too sensitive. He would tell her he was stressed from work, that he didn't mean to lash out. He would wrap her in his arms and kiss her forehead, telling her he loved her. And for a while, she believed it. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that it wasn't his fault, that he hadn't truly meant to hurt her. But as time went on, the pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just the cruel words anymore. It was the way he looked at her, the way his eyes hardened when she spoke, as though her very presence irritated him. It was the cold silences, the times when he would ignore her completely, leaving her to wonder if she had done something wrong, if she was the reason for his sudden detachment. It was the small digs, the sarcastic remarks, the comments about how she could never do anything right, how she was always messing up, and it wore on her. It wore on her so much that she stopped speaking up, stopped asking questions, stopped expressing her needs and desires. Because every time she did, it was met with an angry outburst or a dismissive comment. She learned to swallow her thoughts, to keep them to herself, and to walk on eggshells around him, careful not to upset him further. But the emotional abuse wasn't enough for Russell. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the control and the manipulation began to escalate. His words were no longer just sharp edges, they became weapons. He would call her names, belittle her in front of others, make her feel small and insignificant. He would push her to the brink, testing her patience, watching her tremble under the weight of his words, and then he would turn it around, spinning it in such a way that she felt like she was the one at fault, the one to blame. He would raise his voice in such a way that it rattled her bones, sending a chill of fear down her spine, even when she hadn't done anything wrong. In the early stages, Angelica tried to speak up. She tried to stand her ground, to explain how his words made her feel, but every time she did, he twisted it, made it about her emotional instability, about how she was overreacting. He would accuse her of being too sensitive, too dramatic, too crazy. And she would shrink back, her confidence shattered, her voice silenced, because somehow, in the face of his cold, calculated rebuttals, she started to doubt her own reality. She started to believe that maybe she was the problem. Maybe she was the one who couldn't handle the relationship. Maybe she was the one who couldn't live up to his expectations. But the worst came when the emotional violence was no longer enough for him. One night, it all reached its boiling point. They had been arguing a small, insignificant thing that she could barely even remember, but Russell's anger had been building for days, and he couldn't contain it any longer. His words were sharp and venomous, cutting into her like a knife. When she tried to respond, to defend herself, he shoved her hard against the wall. The impact knocked the breath out of her, her back slamming into the hard surface, but it wasn't the physical pain that lingered the most. It was the shock, the realization that the man she had loved, the man she had married, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Her body was still aching, her skin burning from where he had pressed against her, but the worst part was the sense of betrayal. This was the man who had once held her in his arms, who had promised to protect her, to cherish her. This was the man who had once been her knight in shining armor, and now he was the one who had shoved her into a wall, the one who had made her feel like she was nothing more than a punching bag for his rage. He had become the very thing he had promised to protect her from. And in that moment, Angelica realized something that she couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't love. It was control, it was manipulation, it was something darker than she could have ever imagined. The next morning, Russell acted as though nothing had happened. He showered her with affection, apologized in the way he always did, his words smooth and practiced. He told her it was a mistake, that he had been under stress, that he didn't mean to hurt her, and Angelica wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he was still the man she had fallen in love with. But deep down, she knew that something had changed, something fundamental that could never be undone. She wasn't stupid, she knew the cycle, the apologies, the promises, the gifts. They were all part of the same dance, the same manipulation that kept her tethered to him. As the days passed, the emotional violence turned physical again. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to keep her on edge. He would grab her arm too tightly, shove her away when she tried to speak, and sometimes, when his temper flared, he would throw things. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, he knocked a glass off the counter, watching it shatter on the floor, before turning his fury on her. She stood frozen, her heart racing, wondering if the next blow would be for her. She had never been more terrified in her life. And yet, she couldn't move, she couldn't leave. Because every time she tried, he would convince her that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, that she was just overreacting, that she was the one making things worse. It wasn't until much later that Angelica realized just how deep the abuse had gone. The emotional scars were far worse than the physical ones, because they made her question her worth, her strength, and her ability to trust herself. She had been broken down, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a shell of the woman she used to be. But it was in that moment of deepest despair, in the quiet of the nights when the bruises healed but the pain lingered, that Angelica found a flicker of hope. She knew she couldn't live like this anymore. She knew she couldn't keep making excuses for him, for his actions. She knew it was time to break free, but the question was, how? This was only the beginning of a long journey for Angelica, one that would test her in ways she never thought possible. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was one thing she was sure of: she couldn't stay in this cycle of abuse. The man she had married was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. But in the darkness of that realization, Angelica knew one thing: she would find her way out. She had to. There comes a moment in every silent struggle when the body and mind can no longer accept the weight they've been carrying. It's not a dramatic event, not a sudden burst of courage that makes you stand tall and scream out your defiance. No, it's quieter than that. It's the gradual realization, deep within yourself, that you are not what you've been told you are. That you are not as small as they've made you feel. For Angelica, that moment arrived not with a loud bang, but with a subtle shift within herself that she could no longer ignore. For so long, she had lived in the shadows of Russell's dominance, the weight of his control pressing down on her every step. She had been silent, passive, a mere observer of her own life. It wasn't that she lacked strength, but rather, she had been trained to suppress it, to be smaller, to apologize for existing. She had believed for too long that her silence was what kept the peace, that by submitting to his needs, his wants, his control, she was somehow protecting herself and their marriage. But that illusion, built on years of manipulation, began to crumble. It was not one incident, not a single fight, that broke her. It was the slow, insidious erosion of her sense of self. The more Russell pushed, the more he demanded. The more Angelica shrank until there was nothing left but a shell of the woman she used to be. She had become a reflection of his will, a mere vessel carrying out his orders, with no voice of her own. But beneath that silence, beneath the facade of obedience, something began to stir. It wasn't the loud, rebellious cry for freedom that many might expect. It was quiet, a soft murmur deep inside her soul, but it was unmistakable. A voice within her heart whispered that she deserved more. She began to see things differently, not because of what was happening to her, but because of what had already happened. The emotional scars had been building for years, but the physical abuse, the shoving, the bruises, the physical force had only left her more broken. It wasn't just the anger in his eyes that terrified her anymore. It was the complete absence of love, the coldness that had taken the place of affection. Russell wasn't the man she had married. He had become a stranger, a tyrant, a man who would no longer even pretend to love her. There is a peculiar kind of numbness that comes with prolonged abuse. At first, it's the shock of the first blow, the first time you're truly afraid of the person you trusted most in the world. But as time wears on, you adapt, you grow used to it. The harsh words, the silent treatment, the aggressive outbursts, they become a part of your daily life. And when you don't have the strength to fight back, you begin to believe the lie that this is the way things should be. That maybe you're the problem, that maybe, just maybe, you deserve this. But there comes a moment when even the deepest numbness can't hold you back anymore. Angelica's breaking point was not dramatic, nor was it a sudden rush of anger. It was the realization that she had no more apologies to give. She could not keep sacrificing her identity, her sense of worth, for someone who didn't value her. She could not keep pretending that she was invisible, that she didn't have the right to speak, to breathe, to live freely. One night, After another brutal argument, when the words had been sharper than knives, when the insults had torn into her soul like jagged pieces of glass, Angelica stood still in the quiet aftermath. Russell had stormed off to sulk in the other room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She could feel the familiar tension in the air, the cold silence that always followed his rages, the silence that wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, she wasn't as small as she used to be. It wasn't a loud declaration. It wasn't a moment of shouting or even confrontation. It was the simple, unyielding decision that she would no longer be silenced. Angelica didn't need to scream to make herself heard. She didn't need to fight back with words or actions. It was the quiet rebellion of her heart, the realization that she had the power to choose her own life. And with that realization came the faint but undeniable strength to take control of her future. She would no longer allow Russell's cruelty to define her. The change was subtle. It started with small decisions. She began speaking her mind, not out of anger, but out of necessity. When Russell belittled her or tried to control her, she stopped apologizing. She didn't fight him, but she stopped allowing him to dismiss her. She learned to say no, I won't do this. No, I won't be quiet. No, I won't be invisible anymore. And every time she stood her ground, no matter how small the action, she felt a piece of herself return. She didn't need to win every argument. She didn't need to confront him with anger. But she could stand tall, at least in her own mind, and know that she wasn't going to shrink any longer. Her rebellion wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was powerful. It was the rebellion of a woman who had been broken, but was no longer willing to accept the pieces she had been given. It was the rebellion of a woman who finally saw herself as worthy of more than the life she had been living. And as she began to reclaim those small moments of autonomy, she started to rebuild herself, piece by piece. The turning point was not just about breaking free from Russell's grip. It was about Angelica finding her own voice again. It was about reconnecting with the woman she had lost. And though the road ahead would be long, though there were many more battles to come, Angelica knew that she was no longer the woman who had stayed silent. She was no longer the woman who had allowed herself to be controlled by someone else's desires. She was a woman who had learned to fight not with her fists, but with her heart, with her will, and with her quiet rebellion against the life that had tried to erase her. The decision to leave, to break free from the cycle of abuse, wouldn't come overnight. But Angelica had taken the first step, and that was the moment everything began to change. The woman who had once been silenced, who had once believed that she was nothing more than a reflection of someone else's desires, had begun to live for herself. And in that quiet rebellion, in that small act of defiance, Angelica found the strength to reclaim her life. When the day finally arrived, the one she had been quietly preparing for, it didn't feel like an eruption. There was no dramatic scene, no bombastic confrontation. Instead, it felt like an awakening, a long, slow realization that the time for change had arrived, and with it, the possibility of something better. Angelica had been living in the shadows for so long, her life dictated by someone else's whims, someone else's desires, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist for herself. But now, after years of pain, fear, and silence, she was standing at the precipice of her own life, ready to step into the unknown, ready to claim the future that had been stolen from her. The decision to leave wasn't easy. It never is, especially when the life you've built, or rather, the life someone else has built for you, has become a prison. Russell had been a force in her life, a presence that demanded to be noticed. For so long, she had been his audience, his confidant, and his captive. But the person who had once worshipped him, who had believed in the facade he'd presented, had long since disappeared. And in her place stood a woman who had learned to see through the cracks in the glass, a woman who had learned that she was worthy of more than the scraps of affection Russell had been willing to give. There is a peculiar kind of power that comes with leaving someone who has controlled you. It's not the power of revenge or of getting back at them for all the hurt they've caused you. No, it's the power of reclaiming yourself, of standing up and saying, I deserve better. I deserve to be loved, respected, and treated with dignity. That was the power Angelica was tapping into. It wasn't about throwing punches or making a grand statement. It was about taking back the parts of her soul that had been stolen, step by quiet step, over the years. The first step in her new life was one that felt almost impossible. It was not an act of defiance, but an act of survival. The first thing Angelica did was take her son, Benjamin, and leave. She didn't pack everything up, didn't make grand declarations to Russell. There was no fight, no last words. She simply gathered what she could, the things that mattered most, her son, the few possessions she couldn't live without, and her resolve. The rest of it, the house, the car, the life that Russell had carefully curated for them, she left behind without a second thought. It wasn't the material things she was walking away from, it was the hold Russell had on her. It was the shackles she had worn for so long, the ones that had kept her in place, small, quiet, and invisible. For a while, Angelica didn't know what would come next. She didn't have a grand plan or roadmap to her future. But for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in so long: freedom. It was a small thing, barely noticeable at first, but it was there. She was free to breathe again, free to feel. Free to make decisions without someone looking over her shoulder, second-guessing everything she did. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Angelica was living for herself and for Benjamin. There were days, of course, when the weight of the decision hit her. She had left behind everything she had known, everything she had worked for, or, at least, everything she had thought she was working for. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the fear of the unknown threatened to swallow her whole. Could she really do this? Could she really rebuild a life from nothing? But every time those thoughts came, Angelica reminded herself of why she had left. She reminded herself of the woman she had once been, the one who had dreams and ambitions. The woman who had a future beyond the confines of Russell's control. That woman wasn't gone. She was still there, buried beneath the layers of pain and self-doubt. And now, it was time to rediscover her. It wasn't easy, of course. There were weeks of uncertainty, of struggle, of figuring out how to live in a world that she had been shut out of for so long. Angelica found a small apartment, one that was simple but safe. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't anything she had imagined for herself when she had first dreamed of her life with Russell. But it was hers, and that made all the difference. She began to rebuild her life piece by piece, starting with the things that mattered most: her son and her own sense of self-worth. She found a job, a modest one at first, but it was hers, and it was a step forward. She enrolled in classes, taking the first steps toward completing her degree in biology, the dream she had set aside so many years ago. It was exhausting, trying to balance work, school, and being a single mother. But it felt right each night as she lay in bed, exhausted but content. She realized that she was finally living the life she had always wanted, even if she had never truly known it until now. And then came the unexpected help, the lifeline she hadn't known she needed but had always dreamed of. Rachel, her sister-in-law, who had been so distant from the family, reached out to Angelica. At first, Angelica had been hesitant, unsure if she could trust anyone in Russell's family. But Rachel, with her quiet strength and unwavering determination, became a source of support that Angelica hadn't known she was missing. Rachel's decision to stand by Angelica, to help her navigate the legal battles, to make sure she was not alone in this fight, was the final piece that Angelica needed to realize that she was truly free. With Rachel's help, Angelica began to fight back, not just for herself, but for Benjamin. The legal battles were grueling, but with every step, Angelica gained more confidence. She gathered evidence, built her case, and began to reclaim the control that had been taken from her. And as the days passed, she began to see a future, not one that was perfect or easy, but one that was hers to shape. She no longer had to live in the shadow of someone else's decisions. She could make her own. And then, as the years passed, the rewards of her hard work began to show. Angelica finished her degree, and soon after, she was offered a position at a prestigious scientific institute. Her work, her passion for biology, had led her to a place of stability and achievement that she had once thought was out of reach. She had done it. She had rebuilt her life, and in doing so, she had created a new beginning, one where she could be proud of who she was, of the woman who had overcome so much. The final victory came when Angelica made a groundbreaking discovery in her field. A rare strain of algae that had the potential to save lives. And when the time came to name it, she didn't hesitate. She called it Ratuline in honor of the woman who had helped her find her way, who had given her the strength to reclaim her life. As she stood there in the lab, watching her work come to fruition, Angelica knew that the road to freedom had been long and difficult. But it had been worth it, because it had led her to a place where she was free to live, to love, to dream again. And she would never take that freedom for granted. The woman she had been, the one who had lived in the shadow of fear and control, was gone. And in her place stood a woman who was stronger, more resilient, and more capable than she had ever known herself to be. The story of Angelica's journey is one of transformation, resilience, and the reclaiming of power. From a woman who felt trapped and diminished by the actions of someone she loved to someone who found the strength to break free and rebuild her life, Angelica's journey is a reminder that we all have the potential to change our circumstances, no matter how difficult they may seem. Her road to freedom was not instantaneous. It took time, strength, and a deep, internal rebellion against everything she had been told about herself. Yet, in the end, it was her quiet refusal to accept the life of control and fear that allowed her to step into a new chapter of her life. The turning point in her journey came when she finally realized that her silence was not a solution. For years, Angelica had tried to play the role of the obedient wife, suppressing her own needs and desires for the sake of keeping the peace. She allowed herself to become invisible in her own life, convincing herself that the love she had once felt for her husband justified the emotional and physical pain she was enduring. But it was when she began to acknowledge her own worth, when she started listening to her inner voice that had long been silenced, that she was able to break free. Angelica didn't have to shout or rage to reclaim her life. Her strength came from within. She realized that she had the power to make a different choice. She didn't have to remain in a toxic situation because it was familiar, and that was the catalyst for her journey towards freedom. Breaking free, however, did not mean instant peace. There was no fairy tale ending where Angelica was suddenly living a perfect life. In fact, the hardest part of her journey came after she left. It was in those quiet moments when the world outside felt unfamiliar, when the fear of what would come next threatened to engulf her, that she found herself rebuilding. It took time for Angelica to feel comfortable in her new life. There were small victories, finding a place to live, securing a job, enrolling in her studies again, but each step was a testament to her resilience and her ability to start anew. The road wasn't without its challenges, but each obstacle was met with more determination, more courage. Angelica had fought for so long just to survive. Now, she was fighting to live fully again, to build a life she could be proud of, not one dictated by fear. Through Angelica's story, we learn that the most powerful change often comes from within. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of difficult circumstances, especially when we feel like we don't have a choice. But the truth is, we always have the ability to choose how we respond to life's challenges. Angelica chose to stop accepting the role of a victim. She chose to fight for herself and for her son, Benjamin. She chose to believe that she was worthy of love and respect, no matter what anyone else had told her. And in doing so, she created a new reality for herself. This story teaches us that no matter how trapped we feel, we always have the power to change our path. It may not be easy, and it may take time, but with each step forward, we move closer to the life we deserve. The lesson to be drawn from Angelica's story is one of self-worth and empowerment. Too often, we find ourselves in situations where we feel like we have no choice but to stay, whether in relationships, jobs, or environments that don't serve us. We may convince ourselves that change is too hard or that we don't deserve better. But Angelica's journey proves otherwise. She reminds us that we are the authors of our own stories. We may not control everything that happens to us, but we do have control over how we react, how we rise above adversity, and how we choose to move forward. So, what can we take from Angelica's story and apply to our own lives? The first step is acknowledging our own worth. Too often, we allow ourselves to be defined by others' opinions or by the circumstances we find ourselves in. But we are more than the roles we've been given. We are more than the limitations others place on us. The second step is making the decision to change, to stop accepting a life that doesn't align with our values and desires. Change is never easy, and it often comes with fear and uncertainty, but it is the only way to move toward a better future. Finally, it's about taking consistent, small steps to build the life you want. Every choice you make, no matter how small, brings you closer to the person you want to be. And every step forward, no matter how slow, is progress. Now, I want to leave you with a simple question. If you were in Angelica's shoes, what would you do? Would you continue to accept a life of silence and fear, or would you choose to fight for the life you deserve? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Please comment your answer below, and let's share our ideas and perspectives. Before you go, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel if you found this content helpful and inspiring. Your support will help us continue creating videos that provide value, knowledge, and strength to people going through similar challenges. I also kindly ask you to consider making a small donation to support the channel. Though I am older now, I still want to give back to society and make a positive impact. Your support, no matter how small, helps me continue to create meaningful content that empowers others. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey.